The fact of the matter is, you're still under the umbrella of pro-life. And all of us under the umbrella of pro-life need to stop fighting each other and recognize that we're making progress. And the reversal of Roe v. Wade was not the end of the fight, it's the beginning of the fight. Amen. To have a society that honors human life.
Hi again, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Narrative Podcast. This is Mike Andrews welcoming you into a very special episode today. We are going to feature the keynote address from our recent Essential Summit, featuring a man who likely needs no introduction in Dr. Ben Carson, but I'm going to give you a brief introduction of him anyway. Dr. Carson is founder and chairman of the American Cornerstone Institute, whose mission is to promote the four founding principles, which are cornerstones of our country: faith, liberty, community, and life, while also pursuing common sense solutions that challenge conventional groupthink. He most recently served as the 17th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for nearly 30 years. Secretary Carson served as Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Children's Center, a position he assumed when he was just 33 years old, becoming the youngest major division director in the hospital's history. Dr. Carson received dozens of honors and awards in recognition of his achievements, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. He authored 11 books, 5 of which he co-wrote with his wife, Candy, but their greatest collaboration is raising 3 adult sons and enjoying their 8 grandchildren. And after Dr. Carson speaks, you're going to hear a special roundtable with a couple voices I think you'll recognize in Aaron Bear and David Mahan. They'll also be joined by Ian Rowe, who is one of the original guests on our podcast. I believe it was the second episode ever. So it's going to be a great episode. We're excited to share this with you today on The Narrative. Now enjoy Dr. Ben Carson's keynote address from the Essential Summit.
You know, I want to talk just a little bit before we have our panel about some of the things that are going on in our society today. You know, it was Benjamin Franklin who famously said when he was coming out of Constitution Hall in 1787, and he was asked, "Sir, what do we have here, a monarchy or a republic?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." That is a big if, because we're at a place in our country right now where some of the things that we always assume to be true are not true, like freedom of speech. That started disappearing a couple of decades ago with the advent of political correctness, which then morphed into wokeness, and now has morphed into situations where people are punished, are canceled for things that they say, for thoughts that they express. And I'm sure that no one 20 or 25 years ago would have thought that would be going on in our country. No one would have thought we would have a country where the political party that's in power would be using the Department of Justice to go after their political opponents. In the United States of America, the shiny city on the hill, the beacon of justice. But unfortunately, that's exactly what has happened. And think back on the beginnings of our country. Think of our founding document, the Declaration of Independence. It says that our rights come from our Creator, not from government. And they can't be taken away from us. And we have to reach a point where we're willing to fight for our rights. Doesn't mean that we have to all go out and buy AK-47s, but it means we have to be willing to stand up for what we believe in. It's so vitally important in the society that we live in right now, because the key tool that the left uses to control people is fear and intimidation. And if they can make you afraid to express what you believe, they've won. And that's happened to a large degree. Fear can really control us. I remember as a youngster, I was afraid of dogs. I was deathly afraid of dogs. And I would frequently be late to school, because I'd almost be there and then there'd be a dog. And I would have to go all the way around the block and come back from the other direction. And then there'd be another dog. And, the teachers were getting kind of tired of me. But there was a man who said, Benny, if you act like you're not afraid of the dog won't bother you. He says it doesn't matter how big and ferocious the dog is, if you just ignore them, don't let them know that you're afraid, they will not bother you. I said, are you sure about this? But I decided I would try it out, because down the block, there was this very mean dog, and no one liked to go down there. So I said, I'm going to walk right down there where Rusty is, and I'm going to act like I'm not afraid of him. And I walked boldly down there, and Rusty saw me, and he started licking his chops. And he came charging after me, barking and snarling, and he ran right up to me, right up to my leg, and I said, this was a mistake. But he just sniffed my leg, turned around, walked back, and sat down on the porch. That was the last time Rusty ever bothered me. He would bother other people, but when I would walk by, he didn't bother because I knew I wasn't afraid of him. And it is amazing how fear can control you, but how you can control fear too. I remember there was a case, a surgical case, of a young man who had von Hippel-Lindau disease. This is a disease in which they develop these very vascular tumors in the central nervous system, and he had developed one in his pons, part of the brainstem, an inoperable part of the brain. So none of the adult neurosurgeons would operate on him. And unfortunately for me, his wife was a pediatric neurosurgery nurse who worked on the floor where most of my patients were. And she said, you're going to have to operate on my husband. I said, but I'm a pediatric neurosurgeon. And she said, he acts like a child. And she just kept after me, and finally I gave in, and I said, I'll go talk to him. And I said, Craig, this is in your brain stem. This is an inoperable part of the brain. And I said, if I operate on this, there's at least a 50-50 chance that you will die on the table. And he said, Doc, if you don't operate, there's a 100% chance I'll die. So I'll take it. Very mature. And so I took him to the operating room. It was a very difficult operation. A lot of new blood vessels had grown into the area, but I, under the high-powered microscope, was able to clear a small area on the brainstem and make an incision and put in a little micro probe, because you couldn't see in there. You'd have to just feel for a consistency change. And when I felt it, I knew that's where the tumor was. And I put in a little micro forceps and grabbed the capsule. Couldn't see it, but gradually start pulling it out and using another micro instrument to free the tissue away from it. And the tumor was peeking out of the hole. I could see the edge of it when the anesthesiologist said, the evoked potentials have gone flat. That's the electrical impulses from the brain. You killed him. Because he was very opposed to the operation. So he was, I think, kind of feeling victorious in his prediction. Well, it was very somber. The rest of the operation, we got the tumor out, closed up. Patient had no function, went back on full life support. They were very devout Christians, this young man and his wife, and we had done a lot of praying about this. And I can't emphasize strongly enough the power of prayer. You do your best and you let God do the rest. Well, the next morning when I came in, he was sitting up in the bed. He had been extubated and he was telling jokes. But I would have never attempted that had I allowed myself to be controlled by fear. And that's my main message tonight. We have to be unafraid. We have to be warriors for Christ our Savior. You know, our country is depending upon it. There are enough Christians and evangelicals in this country to control the direction of the country if we only would do it. But so many people won't vote. How many people do you know who sit at home and complain but don't vote? And they say, well, it's all corrupt. I don't want to be a part of a corrupt system. I don't want to be in a position of choosing between the lesser of two evils. Have you heard that before? I'm sure you have. Well, every election is a choice between the lesser of two evils unless one of the candidates is Jesus Christ. So, you know, that's why we have a brain. And then you see these people who say, well, I like a certain person's policies, and I think he's a good leader, or she is a good leader, but I can't stand them. I don't like them. I could never vote for somebody like that. Well, suppose you were a patient and you had a very serious disease that could be cured by excellent surgery. Would you rather have the surgeon who has poor bedside manner but saves everybody, or the one with wonderful flowery words who kills everybody? Again, that's the reason that we have these incredible brains. And God has endowed us with it. He didn't leave us here to struggle by ourselves. But you know, when I was a kid, I didn't think that my brain was very functional. And none of my classmates believed that either. And none of my teachers did. The only person who thought that I was smart was my mother. You know, there's a reason that God gave us mothers. You know, they love no matter what. And she was always saying, Benjamin, you're much too smart to be bringing home grades like this. I brought them home anyway, but she was always having something positive to say. And you know, she had not been able to achieve much education herself, less than a third grade education. Bounced around from place to place, never had a place she could really call home, married at age 13. And later discovered that her husband, my father, was a bigamist and had to raise us by herself. But she had tremendous faith in God. And she always said, God will find the solution, no matter what the problem was. And that had an impact on me. I remember, you know, I did get over being a terrible student. And as a first-year medical student, I was so thrilled because I said, finally, all the hurdles are over with. The last one, I'm in medical school, everything's going to be wonderful from this point forward. And then I did terribly on the first set of comprehensive exams. So poorly, in fact, that I was sent to see my counselor. He looked at my record and he said, you seem like a very intelligent young man. I bet there are a lot of things you could do outside of medicine. And he said, you're not cut out for medicine. You're just going to torment yourself and everybody else. We can help you get into another discipline. I was devastated. My dream disappearing right before my eyes. I went to my apartment and I just said, Lord, I always thought you wanted me to be a doctor, but it looks like that's not going to work. What would you have me do? And then it dawned on me, what kind of courses have you always struggled in? And I realized I struggled in courses where I listened to a lot of boring lectures because I don't get anything out of boring lectures. And there I was sitting in 6 hours worth of boring lectures every day. So basically wasting 6 hours. And I made an executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend that time reading, because I did well in everything that I did a lot of reading in. And the rest of medical school was a snap after that. And years later, when I was back in my medical school as the commencement speaker, I was looking for that counselor because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be a counselor. You know? Because some people are just so negative, and they always have negative things to say. And it's something that we must be very wary of, the negative influence in the lives of our children. Because our children are very vulnerable. They're very suggestible. That's the reason that God gave them parents. But look what's happening in so many of our public school settings, where they spend all this time, teaching them what pronoun to use and, preying upon these children whose brains are not fully developed. Your brain does not fully develop until about the mid-20s. And so it really is very abusive for them to be able to do this frequently without the knowledge of parents. And can you imagine how difficult it would be for a young person who's very suggestible to have those kinds of suggestions thrown out in front of them? And then when you watch television, what are you seeing when you watch television? Within a very few minutes of any program, you see the introduction of an alternative to the traditional nuclear family. And it's presented not only as acceptable, but as preferable. This is what our children are seeing. What about a relationship between a man and a woman? And what about marriage? Have you noticed that people are not getting married until much later, and sometimes not married at all? And then the introduction in the early 60s of no-fault divorce was a terrible plague on our society. And I'll tell you why. Because when two people get married and they come from different environments, of course there's going to be friction. It's like taking two pieces of sandpaper and rubbing them together. There's going to be friction. But what happens if you keep rubbing those sandpapers together? It gets smooth. You got to stay in there long enough for it to get smooth. And we don't teach people that. And we teach people it's all about me, myself, how do I feel? And it's having a deleterious effect. These are things that we in the Christian community need to speak up about. Because God has given us the pattern. He has shown us what His expectations are for us. One man, one woman, together, and they have children, and they flourish, and they care for each other, and they pass values down. That's what's happening. None of that is happening in our society outside of our relationships with Christ. And we're throwing God out. He is no longer welcome in our society. And as a result of that, look at what's happening to us. You don't have to be very smart to see that we are deteriorating very quickly. But the good news is that it's always darkest before the dawn. And sometimes it has to be pretty dark before people can see the light. And I think that is starting to occur. I think we're poised for a revival in this country. But in order for that to happen, we have to be willing in our spheres of influence to speak up for what we believe in. And that might mean persecution. It will mean persecution. The Bible tells us you'll be persecuted. They crucified Jesus. But when you stop and think about it, what is a little bit of inconvenience and persecution against the backdrop of eternity? That's what we have to be thinking about, looking at the big picture, not allowing ourselves to be fearful. Also, we have to be bold. We have a situation now where we are trying to change society to fit the abnormal. Now, I'm going to say something that some people would consider controversial, but sexual perversions are just that, sexual perversions. They are abnormal. And to try to adjust the whole society so that you make that normal is in itself abnormal. It doesn't make any sense. It's not common sense to change your whole society around LBGTQWXYZ. It doesn't make any sense. But people are afraid to say it because it seems like they're being non-compassionate. Or there's a difference between being compassionate and being unwise. And you don't throw away the baby with the bathwater, which is basically what we're doing in an attempt to accommodate what is unnatural. If it was natural for men to be with men and women to be with women, we wouldn't have to worry about the extinction of humanity. But the extinction of humanity would occur. That is not a natural phenomenon. And we have to be willing to tell our children that. And one of the things that's so important about parenting is that you're not going to be able to shield your children from these kinds of influences because they're everywhere. And that's why it's very important to have open discussions with your children. Sit down with your children, watch some of the things that are on television because they're going to encounter those things. But it's better that they encounter them after they've had a discussion with you about what is right and what is wrong and what temptations they will face and how they overcome them than to have to discover that on their own or to hear that from their peers and their associates. We're the ones who have that responsibility. And it's very important also to recognize that the things that are happening in our society, they're not accidental. These are intended things. All you have to do is consult the congressional record from January the 10th, 1963. Congressman Herlong of Florida read in the 45 goals of communism in America, how they plan to fundamentally change our country. It's things like gaining control of the school system and the teacher unions so that you could indoctrinate the kids. Gaining control of the news media and Hollywood so that you could manipulate the opinions and the culture of America. Denigrating the role of the family, removing God from the public square, making sexual perversion normal, natural, and healthy. And the list goes on and on. And as you read it, you recognize that these are all the things that are happening. That's the reason that Nikita Khrushchev said to Eisenhower, your grandchildren's children will live under our system and we won't have to fire one shot. We think we won the Cold War, but they planted a malignant seed that is being watered and will be successful unless those of us who understand what's going on are willing to face it and are willing to fight. We have to be willing to fight for our nation. That's why I wrote that book, The Perilous Fight, because like our nation, we're in a war right now. Our nation was born in the crucible of war. We had to fight strenuously for our freedoms against overwhelming odds. But isn't it interesting that our founders were men of faith? The left will tell you they were not men of faith, they were deists, they didn't really believe in an act of God. It's not true. All you have to do is go and read a lot of their writings. And in particular, you look at somebody like George Washington, who was constantly on his knees praying to God. And look at some of the things that happened in his case. You know, you may be familiar with the Battle of Monongahela during the French and Indian War. It happened in Pennsylvania. Washington was a courier for General Braddock. All the couriers were killed. Washington himself had 2 horses shot from beneath him. He had 4 bullet holes in his coat, no flesh wounds, bullet fragments in his hair. He acknowledged that as a miracle, and it was well known in his time. Well, many years later, one of the Indian chiefs that had been involved in the war was very elderly and was soon to die. And he heard that Washington was going to be in the area. And he said to his braves, "Take me. I want to meet this man." And they took him to Washington. And he said, "Sir, I am an expert marksman. And I shot you 17 times. And my men shot you. And pretty soon I tell them to stop wasting their bullets. And I just wanted to meet the man who is protected by the Great Spirit above." That story used to be in American history books until it became politically incorrect. And there are a whole host of other miraculous things that occurred in the founding of our nation in the early years and the battles that occurred. It's pretty amazing, actually. I could talk for many hours about some of the miraculous things that occurred because God was in our country. God was acknowledged in our country. God was revered in our country. And we must keep him there because it's the only way that we can be successful. We're fighting a very dangerous enemy. And I just want to close before we go to start talking about how vitally important it is for you to exercise the right to vote. Our founders studied every system that ever existed, every governmental system, and they found one thing that they all had in common. They grow, they infiltrate, and they dominate. Doesn't matter how they start. Doesn't matter how lofty the ideals are. That's what they do. And they knew that it would happen in our country too. But they left the ultimate tool of correction in the hands of we the people with the vote. It's so important to exercise that vote. And so many people abuse that. They either don't vote or they just look for the name that looks familiar. It could be Satan. Oh yeah, I know that one. In many cases it is, you know. So, you know, it's necessary to do some homework, to do some studying, to find out who these people are and what they represent, and does it align with your values. But if you vote, you get everybody in your sphere of influence to vote, you understand that we're at a cross-section right now in terms of which way this country is going to go. Is it going to be a country of, by, and for the people, or of, by, and for the government? And if it's the latter, our children are going to live in a very different place than we do, and our grandchildren. And we will find ourselves telling them what freedom used to be like. And if you don't believe me, just look at Venezuela. You know, I've been to Venezuela a number of times before they turned. It was a beautiful place. with lots of resorts and hotels and museums and shopping areas. The biggest thing that people used to argue about was whether or not they were the most beautiful people in the world. We've had the most Miss Universes. I mean, that's the stuff that they talk about. And look, almost overnight, what's happened? They went from the #1 economy in South America to dead last, with people fleeing from there, with violence. Although I must say that their crime rate has gone down by 57% because they sent all their criminals over here, you know? But this is what can happen in a place almost overnight when you allow your values and principles to slip away. And we can do so much better. And it's sort of crystallized in what de Tocqueville said when he came to study America in 1831, ostensibly to study our penal system, but he looked at our whole government. He was very impressed by everything, but the thing that impressed him the most were our churches. And the sermons that he heard coming out of those pulpits, they were so inspirational. And that was what inspired a bunch of ragtag militiamen to defeat the most powerful military force on earth and gave the people a sense of right and wrong, a sense of true morality. And at the end of his 2-volume set, Democracy in America, he said that he had discovered what it was that made America great. He said, America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. I think it is our responsibility to bring back goodness to America. Thank you very much.
Going to bring some friends on stage with us here, and Ian and David, you guys can turn your microphones on. Brought up with us Ian Rowe, a senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. He actually spoke in our Church Ambassador Network conversation a little bit ago. And also he founded a series of public charter schools in New York City, in the Bronx, called Public Prep. And then we also brought up David Mahan, our policy director here with CCV. Ian, because you're going to have to get on a flight here soon, I want to start with you here. We've had a number of conversations here today, both on education, but also we heard from Dr. Roberts and now Dr. Carson about what's happening with the family today. And when you're looking at the education crisis we face all across America, that's very real here in Ohio too. A lot of folks have a lot of different diagnoses about why this is why the education system is failing in so many ways. What's your perspective on this, and what have you seen in your experience?
Well, thank you for being here. It's a great honor, and what an inspiration in terms of your comments. You mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville. One of my favorite quotes of his is when he says, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but in her ability to repair her faults." And I've always found that an inspiring statement, because it says that within our founding, within our documents, within our Declaration of Independence, within our Constitution, we have within those the tools of self-renewal, the tools of self-betterment. And that's what we teach our students, that you have within you the tools of self-renewal, of tools of self-betterment. And many of the students in our school are from very challenged families. We run schools in the heart of the South Bronx, where the non-marital birth rate is 85%, so our kids are not getting exposure. But we say to them, it's not about the family that you're from, it's about the family that you're on the pathway to form. So we talk to our kids about the beauty of what it means to commit your life to someone else. The economic benefits, I mean, there's great data that says children raised in married 2-parent households far exceed in almost every dimension that we care about: education, crime, healthcare. So our school first is grounded in virtues. We take our role as an organization focused on moral formation first, because we believe if we can establish those virtues, decisions like getting married or respecting the inherent dignity of each individual comes more closely. So our school, for example, is organized around the 4 cardinal virtues. Dr. Arnn talked about that earlier today, of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And each of those virtues has an I statement that our students memorize. So courage is I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of uncertainty and struggle. Or temperance, I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and my behavior. That's the grounding we believe you need to create in an educational context so that young people have a better sense of a future orientation, which we like to think also includes building healthy relationships, taking responsibility for your family. That's why, in my view, this is a time to build. Yes, we are on a precipice, but we have to build the institutions that reflect the values that we want to create for the rising generation.
Amen. Well, Dr. Carson, I loved the analogy you used of the 2 pieces of sandpaper rubbing against each other. There's a lot of truth to that, but I also think one of the things that we're seeing in culture today is making the highest goal in life to be comfort, right? And so whenever we come up against a challenge, that challenge is to be avoided, suffering is to be avoided. And yet when I hear you tell your personal testimony, the stories you tell, the stories that we all celebrate are those stories of you overcoming challenges. Can you talk about what we're seeing in culture today of trying to rob children of that opportunity to overcome, have that story that they could look back and say, I'm proud of what I was able to do by getting out of that difficult situation?
Well, you look at things like CRT and how it teaches children, minority children, and African-American children that they're victims and that you're living in a society that is totally unfair. And no matter how accomplished you are, you're not going to achieve what you could have achieved because of that. And of course, if you think you're a victim, you are a victim. And that's exactly the wrong thing to be teaching people. You know, my mother was just the opposite. No matter what was going on, she was always talking about, if anybody can do it, you can do it, except you can do it better. That was constantly drilled into us. And she hated excuses. She never made excuses for herself, which was a good thing, but she never accepted our excuses either. That was a tough thing. And anytime we made an excuse, the next thing out of her mouth was a poem called Yourself to Blame. And we didn't want to hear that poem, so we stopped making excuses. But what a difference it made throughout my entire career, not looking for an excuse. Because if you look for one, you can always find one.
Oh, yeah.
But if you can get a kid to recognize that no matter what anybody else did, there's a reason that God gave you a brain. So you could figure out your way around it. It doesn't matter what Bob or Susan or Mary or John did. And once someone adopts that non-victim mentality, it's very difficult to stop them.
You know, for Dr. Carson as well as Ian Rowe, I've been blessed since I've been at CCB to be around, great men like yourself and Aaron. And, the Ken Blackwells of Ohio, the Dr., Woodson, the Woodson Center. So many times the narrative that we hear in our community is either one of 2 extremes, right? You're a victimizer or victim, right? On CNN, you're all, victimized, and then on Fox, you're victimizers. But then my wife and I have these conversations like, man, we've been married 30 years. We We're both active in the ministry. She runs a pregnancy center. Like, where's our narrative? How in the world are you all able to be so successful with this message in some of our communities? Because there is something that's blocking these messages from like GOP. It's not being received from them. How are you all so successful in getting that message across?
Well, it's difficult to get the message across. You'll notice in a lot of the school systems, and particularly in the higher education, there's a concerted effort to keep conservatives away because they don't want people to hear the alternatives, because when they hear them, they frequently resonate with them. And that's why we go to those places. We actually, I'm all over the place. I'll be in Detroit later on this week. I'll be in Las Vegas. I'll be in Washington, D.C., all still before this weekend. Going and giving that message. But recognize that it's going to be tough because there are those who don't want that message disseminated. And it makes a huge difference because the Bible says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. It's when children are very receptive and malleable, that's when you need to get those messages in there. So vitally important at that point in their life. The Marxists understand that too, and it was Vladimir Lenin who said, give me your children to teach for 4 years, and the seed that I sow will never be uprooted. And that's why they're so anxious to get into our schools early on and plant that poison seed, because it's very difficult to remove it once it's there.
And, and as a school leader, this is something we think about all the time, because our students, in my case, primarily low-income Black and Hispanic students, where the external messages they get is that they live in an oppressive society, that based on their skin color, their position, their gender, they are inherently oppressed. But the idea is that when they come within our four walls, that pivots to what you can do. And one of the most important things we do, we teach a rich history. If you look particularly at the African American experience in the United States, you'll see that 100 years ago, Black families were the most intact. We had the highest marriage rates amongst different demographic groups. I mean, Black Wall Street, this was during the Jim Crow era, where Black entrepreneurs were able to access capital and build businesses and be successful. If we could be that successful under conditions where racism was literally enshrined in law, why can't we have that same success today? So a big part of what we do is we try to demonstrate, we're not asking you to be trailblazers, we're asking you to return in many ways to the successes, particularly that the Black community has had in the past.
And I would just add to that, so many of our young Black males end up in the penal system or dead because they have had a very difficult environment to grow up in. What you could do is take that young man by the hand and walk down the streets of this city, and you could give him a history lesson that he'd never forget. Jan Matzliger, a Black man, invented the shoe lasting machine, which revolutionized the shoe industry throughout the world. And he steps on that clean street, and you tell him it was Charles Brooks, a Black man who invented the street sweeper, those machines with the big brushes. And down that street comes a refrigerated tractor-trailer truck. Frederick Jones, a Black man, invented a refrigeration system for trucks, later adopted for airplanes, boats, and trains. It comes to a stop at the traffic signal. You tell him it was Garrett Morgan, a Black man who invented the traffic signal. And he also invented the gas mask, saved lots of lives during the war. And during the war, Henrietta Bradbury, a Black woman who invented the underwater cannon, which made it possible to launch torpedoes from submarines. And you see a beautiful Black woman walking down the street. A Black man did not invent her, but but you can use that opportunity to talk about Madam C.J. Walker, a Black woman who invented cosmetic products for women of dark complexion, was the first woman of any nationality in America to become a millionaire on her own efforts. You place the hospital, Charles Drew, his contributions to blood banking, understanding blood plasma. Daniel Hale Williams, the first successful open heart surgery in the world. had an operative mortality rate less than 1.5%. You look up at the surgical light, Thomas Edison, no, he wasn't black, but but his right-hand man, Lewis Latimer, was. And you can tell how Lewis Latimer came up with the filament to make the light bulb work for more than 2 or 3 days, invented the electric lamp, diagrammed the telephone for Alexander Graham Bell, was a tremendous inventor in his own right. He walked past the railroad tracks. Andrew Beard, the automatic railroad car coupler, spurred on the Industrial Revolution. Elijah McCoy, the automatic lubrication system for locomotives. People always trying to imitate him, and people would say, is that a McCoy? Is that the real McCoy?
Yes.
But here's the thing about that. I can take that very same walk down the street for virtually any nationality in this country and point out wonderful things that were done. And that's what made America great. Our diversity is not a problem.
Amen.
Yes.
I'm going to take this brief moment to say thank you to Ian Rowe. He's got to get on a plane, but I wanted you to at least get a chance to hear from him.
Yes.
Ian, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Dr. Carson, you are an inspiration. The great things about each one of those people that you mentioned, what we try to say to our students, these people were exceptional, but they didn't just pull themselves up by the bootstraps. They were part of strong communities. They were part of strong, typically married families. They had strong faith commitment. They had a strong work ethic. Those same characteristics can be replicated today in a context where the same legal barriers no longer exist. So thank you very much, and thank you for your inspiration.
Join me in thanking Ian Rowe. So now we get to put Dr. Carson in the pressure cooker with David and I. Dr. Carson, I do want to maybe pivot towards what's on the line in this upcoming election. I appreciated your plug on voting, and you all will get a chance on your way out. Our nonpartisan voter guides, if he's talking about doing your research, we have thousands of those here with you to take home with you to your church. Early voting starts next week, October 8th, and your church is able to give out these voter guides so people know these issues, they know these candidates, and they're able to vote. So, Dr. Carson, there's always every election cycle. We always say it's the most important election in our lifetime. I'm not going to say that on this one because I don't know. We'll look back and see which one in time. But we do know this is a very important election, and the stakes are incredibly high in a lot of different ways. What is your biggest concerns about this upcoming election, about where our nation is today?
Well, my concern about this election is if KH wins, she is the most radical left-wing senator in history who's run for president. And her running mate is not far behind her. And they will enact left-wing radical policies, no matter what they say. She says she's moderated and fracking is wonderful and all this, changed all of her opinions. The reason you know that she has not changed her opinions is because the left is not mad at her. If they really thought she had changed her opinions, they would be raging in the streets. So she's the same person who will try to stack the Supreme Court, who will try to make Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico states so they can add a couple more senators, who will do a whole host of things, who will spin us into oblivion, who will basically create an inflationary spiral that is unprecedented, will make everybody's earnings of no effect, and will make people dependent upon the government. All of those are the things that Marxists try to do. That will happen. And that's why I can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to do everything we possibly can. You know, if God was willing to save Sodom and Gomorrah for 10 people, we got this. But we have to do our part. That's the important thing.
In Ohio, we had issue 1 last year where the abortion amendment did not go our way, right? The abortion folks got their way. Just recently, we saw that President Trump took life basically out of the GOP platform, essentially. Many Christians have said that they will not vote for him because of that. What wisdom could you offer to those believers?
Well, that's a very good question. Whether you believe that life begins at conception, as I do, or at 6 weeks when there's a heartbeat, or 15 weeks when there's sensation, the fact of the matter is you're still under the umbrella of pro-life. And all of us under the umbrella of pro-life need to stop fighting each other and recognize that we're making progress. And the reversal of Roe v. Wade was not the end of the fight, it's the beginning of the fight. Amen. To have a society that honors human life. That's the way I would look at it.
Amen. That's very well said. Well, will you all join me in thanking Dr. Ben Carson for joining us this evening?
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.